I recently reread a book about one of my all-time favorite CEOs, John Malone of Liberty Media. The book is Mark Robichaud, Cable Cowboy. I believe originally it came out in 2002. By that time, John Malone had already had a full career in the cable TV business, had sold TCI, which he had built up together with Bob Magnus. And here are the top 10 lessons that I drew from John Malone's career that came out of this book, as well as other sources that I have consulted over the years. Lesson 10, control the story. No matter what size company you lead, there's always a story in the marketplace about your company. And what John Malone realized was if he wasn't going to let the regulators, politicians, consumer organizations, the telecom industry, or internet companies ultimately define for the marketplace what TCI stood for, then he had to do it. And John Malone accepted that responsibility, and what he did quite well was talk about where TCI was ultimately going, painting a bright future for the company. So, for example, he once talked about having 500 channels on cable TV way before that was even thought of as a potential reality. He also talked about having interactivity through cable. Again, that was an innovation that came years later, but John Malone really tried to control the story that was out there about TCI through those kinds of statements. Lesson 9, be a capital allocator, not just a business builder. All CEOs have an intuition to focus on the strategic future of their business, the strategic direction, the operations of the business, and so forth. Very few are adept at capital allocation, which ultimately is as important, if not more important, than the other responsibilities of a CEO. Because capital allocation really determines where the cash that the company generates is ultimately deployed, and that results either in spectacular returns or terrible returns for the owners of the company. I'll read you one excerpt from the book that makes it quite clear that John Malone was capital allocator first and then a cable TV executive second. Malone was developing a formidable reputation in the industry, and that was fine with him. In June of 1989, Channels magazine summed up the growing feeling among Malone's critics. They view Malone as an arrogant, opportunistic, no-nonsense, deal-obsessed hard-ass of a man with little interest in or passion for television, save what money he can make from it. In their view, chicken coops or tires could as easily be the product he was selling, all of which was pretty much on target. And I doubt that even Malone would seriously dispute those statements. Lesson 8. Use debt leverage prudently and for the benefit of your company's equity owners. John Malone always used debt leverage for a few different reasons. One, leverage can be tax efficient because in the US you are allowed to deduct interest payments from income tax obligations. Also, what John Malone did very well was use subsidiaries and other structures to raise debt that was non-recourse to the parent. And this way, John Malone could get the benefits of leverage while really minimizing the risks to the parent company. And finally, and we saw this much later, when we went through the period of basically 0% interest rates, is that John Malone recognized that as an opportunity and actually had his Liberty entities raise long-term fixed-rate debt at very, very low interest rates. That, of course, proved extremely prescient once inflation reared its head and interest rates started going higher. Lesson number 7. Talk to your competitors to find common ground and improve economics for all. This is again vintage John Malone, because a lot of CEOs are adversarial with their competitors. They are perhaps even in empire building mode, and so it leads to irrational competition at the end of the day. And John Malone always had the view that, hey, we're all trying to make the most money. Let's sit down and see where we have common ground, where we can lessen competitive impacts on everybody. And he did that quite successfully throughout his career. These days, when an industry is run by a few competitors that actually do something similar, we refer to that as rational competition, and makes a ton of sense for all the players involved. And I'll give you an example from the book, which is quite illuminating, where Leo Hindery, the person John Malone brought in to run TCI at one point, and to whom John Malone later said that he was incredibly indebted for everything that Hindery did to maximize value at TCI. Hindery said, and this refers to Rupert Murdoch's entry into the US market with his Sky TV network, where he intended to really compete with and crush the cable operators with a satellite offering. And Hindery said, we concluded with both organizations, that's TCI as well as Murdoch's company, saying, let's talk, let's not wail on each other. And during the spring of that year, Hindery approached News Corp Chief Operating Officer Chase Carey about the possibility of bringing Murdoch into the cable tent. Both Hindery and Malone were playing the role of peacemaker, trying to convince the fellow cable operators that there was more profit in peace than war. It makes so much sense, but so few CEOs actually do this the way that John Malone did so successfully. Lesson 6. Acquire passive minority stakes in your ecosystem. Again, this typical John Malone move, what he did at the helm of TCI was use that as a platform to acquire small minority stakes of, let's say, 10 to 20%, depending on the situation, in content providers, technology providers, and other companies in the cable sector. And that was not only good for TCI shareholders, because those were, in the end, shrewd investments or shrewd agreements. In a lot of cases, TCI put up only nominal amounts to get those minority equity stakes. But what it did was essentially align TCI at the center of the cable ecosystem. Because if you've got a small, however small percentage of a company in your space, chances are very, very high that that company is not going to outright compete with you, but will see you as a as a partner, essentially. And John Malone did that superbly. Lesson number 5. Keep control of your own destiny. This, of course, was superbly important for John Malone because he wanted to control where TCI would ultimately end up. And what's perhaps less well known is that for the longest time, John Malone actually owned virtually none of TCI. The main shareholder was his mentor and who had brought him into TCI, Bob Magnus, whom John Malone respected tremendously, was supremely loyal to. And what happened at one point was that Magnus and Malone's tiny stake to put together could not guarantee that they would retain control of TCI. There were certain regulations that also played into this, so the two of them went to such lengths that, and I don't know the specifics of this or how it even worked, but it's mentioned in the book, that they had this idea that they could park some TCI shares with, I believe, Bob Magnus's dog, and essentially retain control that way, even though they weren't technically allowed to keep those shares. And I don't think that ever blew up in their face, but it just illustrates to what extreme length Malone went to keep control of his own destiny. Lesson 4, minimize taxes. This is, again, one of the most important tools in John Malone's toolbox. Why pay the government any more than you have to was his attitude. He did this, as I mentioned, by using debt leverage, but even more importantly, he did this by using the income statement as a way to reinvest and grow the business. So Malone would focus on cash flow and not reported earnings. We all know how obsessed much of Wall Street and corporate America is with reported earnings, earnings guidance, and so forth. Companies even going to such great lengths as to inflate their earnings just so they can pay Uncle Sam more than they actually have to. There's a really good passage in the book about this, and I'll just read it to you. It refers to the year after AT&T bought TCI, and what frustrated Malone ultimately was that he had a lot of his payout in AT&T shares that he had to keep for quite a while. And so he kept a close eye on what the AT&T gang was doing and just could not understand that they did not grasp this. But here's what the book says about it. Since John Malone had stood on stage with C. Michael Armstrong to announce AT&T's daring acquisition of TCI the previous June, talking about 1998, the signs weren't all that encouraging. The AT&T guys just didn't seem to get it. They didn't understand how cooperative the cable industry was, with arch rivals laying down arms to team up in joint ventures in order to make a bigger profit. Again, this refers to the cable industry's tradition and willingness to work with each other as competitors to make more money for everybody. That was something that John Malone embraced, but AT&T really didn't have a grasp of. But now to the more pertinent tax point. Nor did they respect the financial structures that sought cash flow over earnings and pounded taxes down as flat as was legally possible. It was a joke, Malone told a friend later, annoyed. They'd ask, "Have you ever paid any taxes? Like that's a crime." I said, "Sure, I've paid taxes as little as possible and as late as possible. I'm serious." Then I make them a speech. I regard that as my shareholders' money. It is not the government's. It is my job to save as much of that as I can for my shareholders. The message which Malone proselytized never seemed to take. Just fascinating. Just really, really fascinating. Lesson 3, escape regulation. And this really bedeviled John Malone for a long time as a cable operator, because regulation was really heavy-handed, and it just made it not just harder to run TCI and create maximum value, but it made also everything less fun for John Malone, and that later on had consequences ultimately as to what he decided to do with TCI, and where he extricated himself in order to focus more on Liberty Media, which was not as constrained by regulation. In particular, local regulators often really tried to put the screws on the local cable monopoly, whether it was TCI or somebody else, in terms of what rates they could charge, how much they had to invest in their networks, and so forth. And there's a really fascinating example in the book where we see how Malone could play hardball, and where he actually formed some of the reputation that he had in the industry. So here's the example. Not long after he arrived at TCI, Malone had his first showdown with a city, and TCI's new president for the first time displayed how brutal his tactics could be in protecting his company. In Vail, Colorado, a ski town wedged in the Rockies about 100 miles west of Denver, the city council voted to end TCI's franchise to operate in the city. The council had declined TCI's offer to rewire the system, which it had only recently bought, and refused to renew TCI's contract. Now get this, what John Malone did. Malone's response was silent but devastating. At 6:35 p.m. on November 1st, 1973, the TV screen of every TCI customer in Vail went dark. TCI had pulled all programming, substituting it with the names and home phone numbers of top city officials, including the mayor. The blackout lasted through a Sunday Denver Broncos game against the St. Louis Cardinals, and the phone lines lit up. By Tuesday, the crisis was settled. After setting new terms, Malone wanted to send a message to any city thinking of squeezing TCI at this delicate stage, and it set a precedent for the scores of franchise renewals it faced down in other cities. Wow. I mean, imagine just not really saying anything and then putting the home phone numbers of city officials on a dark screen when everybody was expecting to see a football game. I mean, that is really a baller move, if you want to call it that. But sometimes that's what you got to do as CEO. You have to take that calculated risk and use the leverage that you have. All right, lesson 2, be frugal. And of course, this is something a lot of great CEOs have talked about. You got to control your expenses, and not just when business turns south. You know, cost cutting, why cost cutting? Just cut costs all the time. Just never allow costs to even go above where they should be. And Malone was very, very focused on this. Here's an example from the early days. that was actually kind of funny, but also very illustrative of the lengths to which TCI went in controlling costs during its acquisition spree of other cable operators. Under new plans outlined by Malone, TCI's chief of operations, Sparkman, drove his various divisions with Teutonic efficiency. Within days of acquiring a company, Sparkman would descend with a squad and reorient the newly acquired managers and employees to the Spartan ways of TCI. Spartan ways. You have one time to tell me that you didn't do it that way before, he told new managers in his signature brusque style. The second time you tell me that's not the way we did it before, you're going to get the door hitting your ass on the way out. Each time he cut overhead at a new property, he took possession of any company cars, reserving the best one for himself so that he could drive a series of progressively newer vehicles. Malone allowed Sparkman this little luxury. Times were tough, and a new car meant a lot. It reminded him of pirates plundering the treasure of conquered rivals. The only way somebody in this company is going to get a new car, Malone once quipped to his lieutenants, is to take it away from somebody else. Wow. That is frugality. And lesson number 1, check in with yourself periodically about your priorities. And here we're talking personal priorities of the CEO, because no matter how rewarding financially a job is, you got to make sure it aligns with your life goals as well. And there's a terrific example, actually quite instructional as to what to do specifically, of Malone doing precisely this. In July 1993, John Malone took a rare moment to stop obsessing with business and evaluate his future. He was on board TCI's Canadair Challenger jet headed for Sun Valley, Idaho. Aloft in the clouds, Malone felt a familiar pang of uneasiness as he weighed life at 52. Here he was, leaving his family in Maine, hemorrhaging inside over the draconian regulation of the cable industry under a new law, and not enjoying any of it. And now we get to the actual list he made. Malone began to dissect the issue, and soon a list was forming in his head. He pulled out a yellow legal pad. At the top he wrote John and Leslie's goals and objectives. Leslie was his longtime wife. Under that heading, he made a list. To reduce stress, to have more fun, to ensure a safe and liquid personal investment portfolio, to generate predictable income to support our lifestyle, to reduce government, media, and legal exposure by taking myself out of the public eye. John was a fiercely private person, an introvert. He did very well in interviews and so forth, but he really didn't enjoy that side of the job. And finally, to honor commitments and moral obligations to family and business associates. And now we're not done yet. He then started a second list, reciting actions to reach those goals. The first would in many ways be the easiest, and the other tasks would fall into place after it. So here's the first. Retire from TCI. Pretty big. Reduce outside public board memberships from 11 to 4. remain chairman and controlling shareholder in Liberty, and stay as chairman of Cable Labs, a research and development arm of the industry. Stay on the Turner board because it was a big TCI investment and because the old cable gang was in it with him. Get the government off TCI's back. Generate predictable income by deferring TCI compensation payments with stock dividends, which should produce sufficient cash to maintain our lifestyle. Say nothing publicly about the contemplated change until Bob Magnus was comfortable. Again, Bob Magnus being John Malone's partner, largest shareholder of TCI, and someone to whom Malone was fiercely loyal all the way till Magnus's untimely death. It was the briefest of blueprints that Malone wanted for himself and Leslie, but one he wanted desperately to build on. His son Evan was 23 years old and his daughter Tracy was 26, and he wanted more time with them and with Leslie. He studied the list and knew the conclusion was inevitable, emerging before him like the tiny, sparse lights of Sun Valley as the TCI jet neared its destination. He must sell TCI. And ultimately, that's what he did with the help of Leo Hindery, who as TCI CEO did a phenomenal job in getting AT&T to pay top dollar. All right, so those are the lessons. I'll just throw in a bonus lesson for those CEOs that run public companies, and this lesson is hugely important, was hugely important to John Malone, and it has a ton to do with good capital allocation on behalf of shareholders. If as CEO you truly believe that your company's stock is undervalued, then it is logical to seriously consider buying back your own shares instead of or in addition to making other investments. As CEO, you know your company better than anyone else, and if those shares are not valued accurately by the market, if they're underappreciated, then you can create a lot of value to your loyal and continuing shareholders by buying back your own stock. This is what John Malone did periodically throughout his career. It's what the great Henry Singleton did at Teledyne, and it really is a wonderful tool, but ideally you do this counter-cyclically. Now, unfortunately, in corporate America, buybacks are not often used in a shareholder value-friendly way. They're often used either to offset stock-based compensation, which can run rampant, or they are done pro-cyclically, meaning the CEO actually gets positive on the business exactly when the whole investment community is positive on the business and the share price is comparatively high. But as CEO, the way to really create value with share repurchases is to be constructive on the long-term future of the business when the market disagrees with you. It's very hard to do, but very, very effective. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed these lessons from one of my all-time favorite CEOs, John Malone.